Hello, everyone. Hello. Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Welcome to another stream. It's Danny Dhaiphong here, and as you can see, I am joined by a friend of the show, Brian Berletic of the New Atlas. How are you doing this evening, Brian?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me back.
Of course, of course. So, everybody who is tuning in, make sure that you hit that like button. It is very much appreciated. That's how you get more viewers into this stream. And of course, go to the links in the description to support this channel in any way that you can. Patreon, Substack. You can become a YouTube member, a part of our community. And all of it goes back to supporting independent journalism and geopolitical analysis. So, we have a lot to get to, Brian, because since the last time we spoke, a lot has happened. Let's get to the most recent events. So we had the Ukrainian, well, I guess no one has taken official credit for this, but over the last 24 hours, 24 to 36 hours, we had a explosion on the Crimea bridge. Now, this is the second time I believe that this has happened since the conflict, although I think Ukraine has been has attacked this region in particular in many different kinds of ways. But this time, this explosion, this attack did kill 2 adults, and the child actually survived, but her parents are dead. And so, you know, Russia says that the U.S. and the U.K. hold culpability in this. Ukraine side was almost gloating about this. It felt almost as if, I mean, they were talking, the defense minister, all that, they talked about how this is strategic militarily and how it's fair game in this conflict. And then, you had the U.S. side say, well, Ukraine needs to figure out how they're going to fight the conflict. However they want to fight it, that's up to them. Which to me was almost more disgusting than the Ukraine side gloating about it. So I'm just wondering your thoughts about this. What is the significance that it doesn't feel very strategic in my mind, but I'm just wondering what your opinion about it is, and maybe what the fallout has been, because I believe Russia has already responded.
Yes, well, as you were talking, I was looking for, because I just saw an article before I came on, and it says Ukraine claims responsibility for attack on Kerch Strait Bridge. But then they were talking about how they suggested that they were behind it, which is what they always do. But it's very obvious. It was an attack, and there's no mystery as to who was behind it. It was obviously Ukraine. They've admittedly attacked it before. They said they were going to attack it. They actually did try to attack it not that long ago. There were missiles that were shot down. And then there have been, along with this attack, several attempts to use drones to attack other targets in Crimea. So it's very obvious that this is Ukraine doing this. It's part of a wider campaign targeting Crimea, and it's part of the ongoing offensive. And we remember the offensive was presented as a means of retaking Crimea, cutting the land bridge, getting into range to destroy the Crimean bridge, and then also begin the process of taking Crimea itself. So no mystery at all who did this. And it was an attack, and it damaged one section of one of the roads. There's two roadways and a railway. There's one section that's damaged, and they will have to replace this just like they did last time. The damage in the last attack was much more extensive. It damaged the rail. It also damaged several of these road sections. This time it's just one road section. So they will replace that. And in the meantime, there will be traffic able to move along the bridge, but it'll be limited. And the rail traffic is not inhibited at all. And I saw today Peter Zeihan. I don't know if anyone is aware of who this guy is, but he's one of these pro-Western analysts, so-called analysts, and he was talking about how the bridge was struck. This is, the bridge is struck. This is going to isolate Crimea. All of the Russian soldiers there are now hostages. They're hostages. The peninsula has been isolated, and Russia is going to have to evacuate it, and it'll be like a modern day Dunkirk. And the reality, and he said the reason why is because Ukraine can also hit the roads on the land bridge with rockets and missiles, which is true, but that's not the same as having a roadway under fire control. That means you have it under fire control. You can hit the road often enough to actually disrupt logistics along it. Ukraine cannot do that, not at this moment. Also, the actual bridge is still operational. He said that it wasn't. He said the previous road spans hadn't been repaired. The train traffic cannot accommodate freight. If you look at the videos from the attack, you can see freight trains moving past in the background in the video footage. So it's PR, but it's trying to be passed off as some sort of major stroke of genius, a strategic move as part of this offensive to finally retake Crimea. And so in reality, Crimea is not isolated. Even if they destroyed the bridge, even if the offensive broke through Russia's defenses, they haven't even made it to the first defense line, but let's say they go through all of the layered defenses and reach the Sea of Azov and cut that land bridge, Crimea is still not isolated because the bridge was only constructed in 2018. It returns to Russia in 2014. So for several years, Russia was able to maintain both its military forces on the peninsula and also the entire civilian economy. So people should think about that. If the bridge was cut, the land bridge was cut, Russia would use its ships and its airlift capacity to maintain at least military capabilities on the peninsula, just like they're doing in Syria. They don't have road and rail supplying their troops in Syria. That's all done by ships and by air. So these are all things to keep in mind as we watch the headlines roll out, trying to boost this in terms of its strategic value. It has no strategic value, strategically meaningless. The death, the violence, the destruction, utterly senseless.
Yeah, and it was impressive enough that Russia built this bridge very quickly after the referendum in 2015. I believe it got finished around 2018. And it's a very impressive piece of infrastructure, and the way that Russia addressed the last attack, it was repaired very quickly. And as you said, more damage was done then. But, what I'm wondering about is, it seems like Russia has in part retaliated to this attack, but it's hard to call it retaliation in a lot of ways because this kind of seems par for the course for the conflict. I think Odessa, Nikolaev have been hit. Russia saying that they've destroyed drone bases, fuel, infrastructure, providing fuel to the Ukrainian military. But it still doesn't feel like a retaliation because this is kind of just what Russia's been doing throughout the conflict. What's your take on Russia's response? I think Putin did vow retaliation in some respect, but this is a conflict and Russia has been going about it in a certain way. What's your opinion about it?
This is a good point to go over because every time Ukraine does something like this, it's extremely provocative. I just broke down how strategically it's meaningless. But when people see this, they're upset. They killed the two parents of a little girl. That's outrageous. People want revenge. They want justice. And it's not just this one attack. It's what the one attack is a small part of something much greater that has been going on since 2014, a vast injustice. But when you are waging war, you cannot allow your emotions to dictate your actions. Revenge will be Russia winning this conflict, eliminating the government in Kiev, and freeing Ukraine of this NATO infestation, the political capture of Ukraine by NATO, essentially. That is how they will get revenge. And this is exactly like in Syria, where Russia intervened at the invitation of Damascus from 2015 onward. And there were multiple provocations. So Turkey, a NATO member, shot down a Russian warplane, and then Turkish-backed militants, terrorists really, ambushed the rescue team, and they were killing Russians. And people at that time said, why doesn't Putin do something? They're angry. They think Putin is a weak leader. They think Russia looks weak because of this. But in reality, Russia was thinking at that time, revenge will be winning this conflict, not acting rash, not giving the West a provocation to escalate, to turn the tide on us by rallying the West or rallying Turkey behind Erdogan when he was so central to serving the proxy war that Washington was waging against Damascus. And if you look now in hindsight from 2015 onward to today, since that plane was shot down till today, look at all the progress Russia has made in Syria. Look at all the progress Russia made with Turkey. Because a country is not just one leader. It is a whole people. It's industry, the population, all sorts of institutions. And Russia was thinking long-term, and they were thinking bigger. So it's like when you play chess, sometimes you see a move that looks great, but if you think several steps ahead, it's actually a disaster. It's a trap. So that's how Russia looks at geopolitics. It's very different than the West, which does react in these knee-jerk actions. These, they're compelled because they've created an image with no fundamentals backing it up. They have to maintain that image. They have to act instantly. Russia's fundamentals are solid. They don't need to maintain some sort of illusion. They need to maintain what they're doing using those fundamentals on the path toward victory.
And one thing I really liked, you recently did a video about this, I believe in the last 24 hours, reacting to the Crimea bridge attack, is you mentioned the particular political situation in Crimea dating back to when this conflict really began, 2013, 14, and of course the referendum in 2015. Could you talk about that? Because one thing that I think might be shocking to Western ears is that Russia has people on its side, and that is a fundamental difference. We can just talk about Crimea maybe here, but really the entire region, there isn't a lot of appetite. I think people have shown through their feet in their voting that there isn't a lot of appetite to stick around and be part of this nation called Ukraine. And that's why Russia has only gotten bigger during this conflict through referendums. But could you talk about Crimea in particular? What is the situation actually there? Because there's all this talk about taking it back. Do people really want to be taken back?
Danny, I sent the link to you in the chat, the private chat of that USAID International Republican Institute. If you want to put that on the screen, but there's a 2013 International Republican Institute and USAID poll that was conducted specifically in Crimea. And notice that the title is the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, because it was not just an ordinary oblast within Ukraine. It had a very special status. It is considered autonomous. It has its own parliament. People say Russia invaded Crimea. No, they didn't. The independent parliament in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea requested Russian forces to protect them when extremists backed by the West were fanning out across the rest of Ukraine, imposing their illegal coup regime on the population of Ukraine. That is what actually really happened. And that is actually reported on even in US government-funded media platforms like Voice of America. Anyway, this let's go through this. This is very interesting. There's many metrics. As you go through, you can see, do people feel like things are going in the right direction? It really gets interesting though on page 8 of, it's actually printed in the bottom right corner of each page.
Yes, here we go.
Yeah, this one right here. Regardless of your passport, what do you consider yourself? And you can see 2011 and 2013, there could be different reasons why these percentages were changing over time. You have to remember, before the US-backed coup, there was a president in power, however imperfect, that actually represented a compromise between all of the different groups in Ukraine. It is there are a significant number of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and then you had the Western Ukrainians, the Banderites, basically, that were sponsored by the U.S. and NATO for years, and they were at odds with each other. The president represented a compromise, and people were more or less happy with the status quo at that time. But of 40% in Crimea saw themselves as Russian, 24% Crimean, and only 15% Ukrainian. So when they talk about, oh, we want to go back and we want to save the Ukrainian people in occupied Crimea, most of the people there saw themselves as Russian, not Ukrainian. If you go down to, say, page 13, I went over all of this in the video. This is interesting, too. Why were they asking this question in 2013? They're asking about what methods of protest would you find acceptable?
Very strange question, honestly, for USAID. A little revealing.
And also IRI is a subsidiary of the National Endowment for Democracy, who we know engineered the 2014 regime change operation in Kiev. And then the next page, if you just scroll down one more, it says, if Ukraine could only enter one international economic union, which should it be? Overwhelmingly, a majority wanted to join the Russian-led custom union, and then 17% the European Union. And there's more people who don't know or care than people that actually wanted to join the EU. So again, it's no mystery when the referendum was held in 2014 to join the Russian Federation, why people overwhelmingly chose the Russian Federation, because this is 2013, before the US helped get Nazi political parties and Nazi armed militias into power in Kiev. If we go down one more page, sentiment toward different countries. So Russia at the top, obviously, there's an affinity for Russia in Crimea. And if you go down to the bottom, the US, it's almost inverted. It's almost entirely inverted there. And then you could see the European Union, Turkey, and Poland are also not very popular. So they rejected the West and their allies, and they liked Russia. They identify with Russia because they themselves see themselves as Russian. And then let's see, go down to 17, page 17. This is the last one.
Status, yeah.
Autonomy in Ukraine, that is the big dark blue bar, and that's the status quo. So autonomy in Ukraine, Crimea was an autonomous republic in Ukraine. They wanted to keep it that way, 53%. But if you look at this 23%, it's kind of like a salmon sort of color. Crimea should be separated and given to Russia. That's almost a quarter of the people asked. They wanted to join the Russian Federation. Again, before the US put anti-Russian Nazis into power in Kiev and began destroying the country. So imagine come 2014, how many more people would want to join the Russian Federation. And this little tiny green sliver, 2%.
2%.
Yeah, that's how many people wanted to be just a normal oblast in Ukraine. So almost nobody. And the referendum, I think it was 95% voted yes, 5% voted no. And if you look at the numbers in this US government-funded poll, it corresponds. There was about 5% who loved Ukraine, loved the United States and the EU, and hated Russia. Those are the people that voted no in the referendum. So if they say the US government did this poll and they demonstrated that the Crimean people wanted to join the Russian Federation without a doubt, even before the coup in 2014. And now after the referendum, the US comes out and says that was invalid. It doesn't represent how the people in Crimea feel. They had guns pointed at their heads when they voted. Absolutely untrue. And look at what has happened in Crimea versus the rest of Ukraine over the last 10 years now. Obviously, their best interests were served by joining the Russian Federation. They have no interest of joining Ukraine ever again. And so when Ukraine talks about, oh, we're going to liberate Crimea, no, they're not. The people have already been liberated.
Yeah. And given this fact, then why does Ukraine, and of course, I think Russia is correct here, UK, US, NATO backers, why do they continue to insist on this point? I mean, this is, let's say, 8 years now almost of being separated from so-called Ukraine. And so why continue on this path of saying we're going to take it back? Russia, I was reading an article in Financial Times yesterday on the stream, and the way that it was portrayed was Russia's occupying Crimea, and that's why it's a legitimate military target. But why even waste this time? Why waste this time?
In reality, this is all about maintaining U.S. hegemony, encircling and containing Russia, and eventually undermining, overthrowing, dividing, and destroying the political order in Russia. That's what this is all about. So Crimea is part of Russia. They want to destroy Crimea. They want to destroy Russia. It's as simple as that. It is a very strategic peninsula. There's no doubt about that. It is the key to controlling the Black Sea, not Snake Island. So I'm sorry to everyone in Kiev. Snake Island is not the key to controlling the Black Sea. It is actually Crimea. And so people might misunderstand me when I say it doesn't matter that they attack the bridge or if they cut the land bridge. It doesn't matter in the sense that Russia will still be able to supply their troops adequately. And they could also sustain the civilian population there. Although I'm sure that if there was an actual threat of the fighting coming to Crimea, Russia would get the civilian population out. And then it would be even easier for them to sustain military operations on the peninsula. So all of these things need to be kept in mind as this unfolds and as the Western media is trying to portray the poor Crimean people held hostage by Russia. It simply isn't so. And this is reflected in a U.S. government-funded poll in 2013.
Yes. Well, perhaps we can now get to what's happening on the ground in the conflict. I haven't actually heard much about this counteroffensive, which has been raging now supposedly for almost 2 months. What's going on here? Things like the Crimea bridge attack, events like that almost feel desperate. And it's not the first time that over this period, Ukraine has tried to strike Russian territory with the help of its backers in the West. So where are things? What's happening with this counteroffensive? Could you maybe help us out here?
It's stalled. So it started on June 4th, basically, and it has been about a month and a half, if not more now, since it started. And if you look at even a pro-Ukrainian live map, these are maps that are updated regularly as progress is made by either side. And you will see that the line of contact has hardly changed at all. There are certain areas where Ukraine has made some progress in the south. But if you look at where Russian defense lines begin, and when I say defense lines begin because they are layered, there's multiple layers of Russian defenses that go from the line near the line of contact all the way back to Crimea. So we're talking tens of kilometers, if not more, that's Ukraine is going to have to cross. They are trying to cross what is called the security zone, or some people refer to it as the gray zone. This is contested space between the front lines, the defenses of Russia and also Ukraine. And that is where they are. And the reason they are having a hard time passing through are all of the reasons you and I, Danny, we've talked about for months now. They don't have air power. They have a shortage of artillery ammunition and also of artillery pieces. They have far less than Russia does. Ukrainian Commander General Valery Zaluzhny said in a Washington Post interview, sometimes we're outgunned 10-1. And this is what Russia has said. This is what Ukraine says. This is what a lot of the more honest analysts in the West have admitted, that there is a deficit in terms of artillery, and it favors Russia. And then there's the situation with tanks and armored vehicles and other long-range weapons. Ukraine has burned through its Soviet-era stockpiles. They had weapons that they modified and developed themselves. They've burned through all of this since the special military operation began, and they've required NATO to send equivalents to them. The problem with this is, even though they kind of, a tank kind of looks like a tank, you have to go through an entire training process, learn how to operate NATO tanks. They're totally different, and they require months and months of training. The Ukrainians are not getting this training. They're getting into these vehicles unprepared. They haven't trained in that vehicle. They haven't trained as a unit of tanks. They haven't trained as a combined arms force, combined armed warfare, is using tanks, infantry, artillery, air power, all in a coordinated manner. Whichever side can do this better is the side that's going to win. And Ukrainian soldiers are operating equipment they're unfamiliar with and did not have time to train, even just operating, let alone using in a combined arms operations. This is their problem. They're trying to cross minefields. The security zone has been extensively mined by Russia, and they're trying to clear these minefields, but they're also being shot by Russian long-range weaponry. You need safe deserts, because this is right out of NATO's playbook, is to clear the minefields and then send your armor through these paths that were cleared onward to shock and awe the enemy. The problem is when the U.S. did that to Iraqi forces in Desert Storm, Iraqi forces didn't have long-range weaponry to hit them when they were clearing the minefields. The U.S. had air power that cleared the other side of the minefield of Iraqi forces. Ukraine is unable to do this, so they're being pounded while trying to clear the minefields, and they're failing to clear the minefields. And so that's why 40-plus days in, they have not crossed the security zone yet. They're close in some areas. And as I've said for weeks, if not months before the offensive began, I said they probably will get through several of the defensive lines. I even conceded the possibility, I don't know the probability, but the possibility of them taking back Bakhmut. The problem with that, if you look at a map, Bakhmut, to the east of Bakhmut is Popasnia, and in between Popasnia are all of these layered defenses there. So Ukraine would have to retake Bakhmut, which will be bloody, or bypass it, which will be bloody, just to reach the first of several defense lines prepared for the offensive in that direction. Russia prepared for this for over half a year. They brought in 300,000 extra troops. It just defies logic what Ukraine is trying to do. It defies logic why the U.S. and their allies are pushing Ukraine to do this. But we've seen this. We've seen this in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Vietnam. We've seen this inability to realize that you have this goal, but you cannot achieve it. But you kick the can down the road for as long as possible anyway.
Yeah, and we haven't spoken since the NATO summit happened, and there was like a renewed promise, I believe, to get these F-16s going. What's the truth about that? Because you've been on this program, on your own program, talking a lot about all of these pledges. Either they take too long to come to fruition, or they don't happen at all within any kind of viable time frame. So what's the deal there? Because I mean, F-16s, they are, if they're modern, they're nuclear capable. So ostensibly a danger, but as you said, Ukraine doesn't have an air force and doesn't seem to be on its way to having one anytime soon.
Well, Ukraine used to have an air force. At the beginning of the special military operation in February 2022, they had an air force, and it was destroyed. It was destroyed on the ground, and what was left of it was destroyed in the air by Russian air defense systems and Russian air-to-air capabilities, which Russia has far more than Ukraine could ever dream of having. The other problem is, even if the West took every spare F-16 they had, hundreds of them, and sent them to Ukraine today, it would make no difference because you need pilots to operate them. Ukraine does not have any pilot qualified to operate an F-16. They will need training. They will need months and months and months of training, and just to learn how to operate the aircraft and then how to operate it effectively, again, as part of combined arms warfare. And they simply don't have the time, and they don't have the number of pilots. And then they're going to have the same, once they get their F-16 set up, they're going to have the exact same problem they had with their original Air Force. It'll be destroyed on the ground. What is not destroyed on the ground will be destroyed in the air by air defense and Russian air-to-air capabilities, which Russia will still have a lopsided advantage regarding. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, well, given that reality, though, the NATO summit did happen. There were a lot of divisions, and while there was, of course, a reinforcement of support for Ukraine, all doesn't seem well between Zelensky, U.S. and NATO partners. What's going on here? I mean, and how will this affect, given that the optics were quite poor, despite them trying to scramble, NATO trying to scramble and look like and make it look like everything is all fine. But it didn't start well with Zelensky's what people are calling, what some observers have called ungratefulness. His tweets, his his very memeable posture, lonely posture at the summit. What did you make of all that, and how do you think it could affect the battlefield situation here on forward?
Oh, you're right. The one thing that the West is really great at is public relations, and the NATO summit was supposed to be a public relations showcase, and instead it came across as NATO being divided. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, an outcast. There's literally pictures of him standing by himself in the corner. It looked like he was lost or something, even if his wife was off somewhere else talking with everybody else. So it looked really bad. But in reality, and you're talking about the comments from the West, from NATO, talking about an ungrateful Ukraine and Ukraine demanding more weapons constantly. And the thing is, this is a NATO proxy war. They're using Ukraine to carry out this proxy war, but I think they might have buyer's remorse at this point. They see it's not working out. They don't know what to do next. They need a scapegoat. They're not going to blame anyone among themselves. They're going to blame Ukraine. It's going to fall on President Zelensky and the people around him. And I think everyone is starting to realize that. Everyone in Kiev is starting to realize that. And think about what was the concrete pledges made were just a handful of additional weapon systems, not even enough to cover their losses just in this recent offensive alone. And the reality is they're running out of weapons that they can send to Ukraine. And the whole problem all along has been, no matter what they send to Ukraine, they are unable to absorb it, integrate it into their way of fighting, and use it effectively on the battlefield. And so the NATO summit was a bad attempt to project strength when in reality, looking on the ground, we can see weakness, growing weakness.
Yeah, and as you said, there might be some buyer's remorse. You mentioned earlier that Russia's victory, its revenge, will be the elimination of the Kiev government. Do we see that government looking the same in the near future, even at when we're thinking about, I mean, I just think about, there is this tension. It's not new tension either. There was, I remember, I believe, was it William Burns who had visited Kiev right around the time there was this kind of musical chairs happening during an earlier part of the conflict within the Zelensky-led government. Sometimes we don't know where certain officials, especially in the defense ministry, where they are at times within this government. Do you feel like there's like a crisis of legitimacy going on within this government? And sometimes Zelensky cannot be found anywhere near Ukraine. I mean, what is going on here? And do you feel like this is going to lead to that the NATO summit was just kind of an indication of things to come for this particular regime?
This is always hard to tell. If people were following the conflict in Syria very closely, the U.S. proxies there were just the worst sort of people, the most undependable, most inconsistent. And then you see the exact same thing now in Kiev. And why is this? Because that's the type of people who are going to sign up to be proxies for the United States. And this is the problem the United States always has everywhere they go. Their proxies are the absolute worst people in any given country. They are people who are willing to betray their nation for their own personal gain and physically destroy their country in the process. What type of person would do that? And so they have a objective that they want to achieve, but they do not have the means to achieve it. They don't have the military means. We just talked about that. They also don't have the means in terms of human resources, the solid type of leadership, competent leadership that you would need to navigate a country through this type of conflict. They simply don't have it. And so this is hard to tell how it's going to develop. If they start changing the government in the middle of the proxy war, I think that would be a bad look. I think they'll try to avoid that, but who knows? Nobody knows. Look at the Vietnam War and the government of South Vietnam. Look at how that all turned out, especially toward the end. It became very chaotic. So anything is possible, and I would just tell people to keep an eye out for that. It's very hard to predict, but it seems almost inevitable that something has to give. Something has to give.
Right. And similar to Vietnam, Ukraine, if something were to give, would have the spotlight on it, because this kind of instability politically is not a strange thing when it comes to proxy wars like this one. U.S. and Western interference usually causes that kind of instability, but generally the spotlight isn't on it. So that would make a difference here, I believe, too, in that it would be a huge blemish, as you said, on the side of the backers. So
Yes.
I wanted to talk about, since the last time we spoke, a lot has also been going on the front of U.S.-China relations. I've been thinking about it over the last 24 hours, even preparing for this conversation, and I'm wondering your assessment. I would call it fake diplomacy. So we had, of course, the Blinken visit, which we talked about, and then immediately Xi Jinping was called a dictator by Joe Biden. But there was recently also a high-level visit from Janet Yellen. I was actually in China, out of Beijing by that time when she came. I believe that was July 7th or 8th. So she came. There was a bit more of even a warmer reception from the Chinese side. She came talking economics, wanting to put some of the political issues aside, differences, and came out with a more, I would say, even a more positive tone in terms of, we'll work out differences. We don't want to decouple. However, here the Financial Times kind of blew. I would say this is a pattern now for U.S.-China, what I would call the fake diplomacy on the U.S. side. You have U.S. officials openly downplaying any hopes of ending restrictions on China trade, meaning the trade war started initially under Trump. Top Biden administration officials dimmed hopes of an immediate easing of tariffs against China this past Sunday, even as they signaled a scope for a more constructive relationship with China. And so, basically you're having the U.S. side say, well, the biggest issue economically for China, the trade war, getting rid of these tariffs, which have hurt the U.S. arguably more than China, that's off the table immediately after she's come. I mean, what do you make of these diplomatic games? Now you have John Kerry there in China talking envoy to envoy, and you also have Jake Sullivan saying right off the bat that China needs to be the one that is held accountable for climate markers and climate change. Your reaction to all of this diplomatic kind of hand-wringing going on?
This is actually a very familiar pattern that the U.S. has exhibited all throughout history. That this is what they do. They pretend that they want to reconcile with any given country that they are aggressive towards, to make it look as if the country that they're targeting is the problem, not them. They're trying to be reasonable. They're reaching out diplomatically, and it's the country that they've targeted and that they continue to pressure, but off to the side, away from the headlines. They continue. All of the sanctions are still there. All of the regime change operations the U.S. is conducting all along China's periphery to surround China with belligerent anti-Chinese client regimes. All of that continues unabated. The military buildup in the Pacific, the U.S. military buildup in the Pacific, that continues unabated. So they're pretending to be diplomatic. They know that China can see that they're being disingenuous, and China's going to respond in neutral or even negatively to this, because they can see what's going on. And they know to Western audiences, they're not going to be sophisticated enough to understand what's happening. They just see an angry China and they say, see, they went there to try to fix things. China's angry with us because it's a dictatorship. It's evil. It's a dictatorship. And we have no choice but then to adopt more aggressive tactics. And just to give a few examples, do you remember when then U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton did that whole reset thing with Russia? And they actually had a physical reset button that they gave it to Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And she was saying, we want to restart, we want everything, we're going to go into the future together. And at that exact moment, she was already planning to overthrow nations friendly to Russia all across the Arab world. The Arab Spring, that was already being organized even at that time. They were already organizing regime change in Kiev, which has been an ongoing project throughout the 21st century. And so they were pretending to be diplomatic toward Russia. Russia could see what the United States was doing around the world. They could see that nothing actually changed, and they maintained their stance to protect themselves accordingly. And then the Western media said, look at Russia, look at them. They don't want to be friends. And so they could shift the blame. They did the same thing with Iran, the so-called Iran nuclear deal. The Brookings Institution in 2009 wrote a whole paper about how we'll make a deal with Iran, we'll sabotage it, we'll blame it on Iran, and then we could use that as a pretext to go to war or apply more sanctions. And the whole world will think we tried to be diplomatic and Iran was determined to get nuclear weapons for all the wrong reasons. They literally were writing this out in this paper. And that was before the Iran nuclear deal was even being talked about publicly, let alone negotiated and then signed. And then sure enough, every part of that Brookings Institution plan was implemented, regardless of who was in the White House. It was eventually unilaterally withdrawn from by the United States. And what did they do? They used that as a pretext to blame Iran and apply more sanctions and attempt regime change. They were doing it, on the streets with their mobs and these terrorist groups that they back in and around Iran. And they continue the proxy war in Syria. What is that actually about? That is about the U.S. removing an Iranian ally before they wage war on Iran itself. That was the whole point of that. So when you look at these two examples, and then you look at what the United States is doing with China right now, it is the exact same process. The U.S. wants to subordinate China. They want to stop it from surpassing the United States. They fully plan to wage war with China if they're allowed to. And all of this is just window dressing to make it look like they tried to be diplomatic and the Chinese left them with no choice but to wage war thousands of miles from their own shores in the Pacific off China's coast.
Yeah, and I think what really gets me about this particular visit with Janet Yellen is that this one issue, and maybe you could talk about this total economic war the U.S. is facilitating against China, because it doesn't get as much, there isn't an open conflict. There isn't a similar kind of proxy war happening out in the open with enormous casualties like what's happening in Ukraine. But the economic war is very much present and very, very much very damaging, including to the U.S. side. This is what gets me, is that even on this one issue, the trade war, giving a little on that, even just getting rid of these tariffs. There's so many other policies the U.S. is pursuing in terms of economic war, sanctions, etc., blacklists, every tech sabotage, so many things. But this trade war issue, they can't let go of it. And immediately after Yellen goes, the top Biden administration officials, of course, all anonymous, usually meaning intelligence services, they're saying, no, we do not want to get rid of the trade war. What do you make of that? It just feels so counterproductive. We often talk about the shooting yourself in the foot analogy. This just feels totally counterproductive.
I think when the United States looks at its relationship with China economically, they can see that it's a net benefit for China, really, when you think about it. But that's just because China is bigger, has a bigger industrial base. It dominates trading all around the world. More and more countries count China as their largest trade partner rather than the U.S. So they're looking at that. They understand that any nation trading with China is just going to help China's economy grow more. And they could see that they are a significant component of that. And they're trying to cut themselves off from China. What they don't seem to understand is that just like with Russia, they're so dependent on China for so many things that by doing so, they're actually going to hurt themselves. And I liken it to when people have cancer and they undergo chemotherapy. They're basically poisoning their body. They're just hoping that it kills the cancer first before it kills their whole body. And that seems to be what the United States is trying to do. That's what it tried to do economically with Russia. Completely didn't work. And now they're trying to do it with China, a much larger nation, which I think has a much more diverse trading relationship with the rest of the world and also economy internally. Plus, they're very close economically with Russia and growing. I don't see how it could possibly work. But from their point of view, the window of opportunity for them to use both their economic and military might in some way as leverage against China, that window of opportunity is closing. And so they're just trying everything they can think of, whether it's going to be painful or not. They're ignoring the damage now. I think, like, basically they're not thinking about the long-term damage that they're going to do to themselves and how this is painting themselves into a corner that they're not going to be able to get out of, just like they've done in Ukraine against Russia. And you mentioned that this trade war with China doesn't seem as extreme as the actual proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. But the United States actually is waging a form of armed proxy war against China all around the globe. Everywhere the Chinese Belt and Road project goes, that infrastructure is being attacked by militants and opposition groups armed and backed by the United States, from Baluchistan in Pakistan to the terrorists in Myanmar fighting the central government, also attacking Chinese infrastructure projects, to the opposition here in Thailand. I just saw them doing a protest, and they had these flyers that they were handing out complaining about the Thai-Chinese submarine deal. It's going to be Thailand's first modern submarines being built and delivered by China. They're against that, but I didn't see any flyers complaining about a possible F-35 deal with the United States. It's strange how that works. And so there's the trade deal, the trade war between the US and China. There's also this very real and violent armed proxy war that the US is waging against China all over the world, everywhere China goes to make inroads. The US is actually physically trying to destroy those roads.
Yeah, I mean, those are all really good points. And, perhaps we can also look at, there was an interesting piece done by NBC. I'll pull it up. I'm not going to maximize it, though, because NBC might literally try to suppress the stream. They've done this in past live streams where they will purport copyright issues. But I want to pull it up because I don't know if you remember, Brian, we've talked about this. Our friend from the U.S. Air Force, Mike Minahan, talking about his memo. He was actually on NBC News recently, actually, and he talked about his reaction to the leaked memo that he put out there, or that was put out there, on the likelihood of conflict and how the United States is preparing for an open war. And so perhaps we could listen to this. I'm not going to maximize it, but let's and besides, he's not a very good looking guy anyway, so we don't have to look at his face so closely. But let's see what they had to say. I found this report very telling about the culture of the media in particular when it comes to this conflict too. So let's take a listen.
Tonight, amid growing tensions with China, we're with American forces in the Pacific, where General Mike Minahan is preparing his airmen for a mission he's warned could come soon.
Do you think the U.S. could be at war with China in the next few years?
It's not me to say whether we could be at war with China in the next few years.
Earlier this year, Minahan, the head of Air Mobility Command, wrote a controversial memo to his commanders warning the U.S. could be at war with China in 2 years, and they need to be prepared.
Do you still believe that?
I don't believe conflict is inevitable. I don't believe it's unavoidable. But I also believe that ready now is what matters most.
There have already been flashpoints. This Chinese fighter jet recently buzzing in America.
Before we get to that, can you just react to this statement of I don't think it's inevitable. I don't think it's avoidable. I mean, those two things don't necessarily go together. What's your reaction to that? I almost laughed when I heard that. And his face, it just tells it all. I don't know if that's the most genuine face I've seen hit the television screen.
Well, when you ask yourself, what will the trigger be? And the trigger is going to be the United States, thousands of miles away from its own shores, off the coast of China, with its warships, its warplanes. They've placed military personnel on the island province of Taiwan, which the United States officially recognizes as Chinese territory. China, by right, can attack now if they wanted to. The United States would never tolerate this if the script was flipped the other way around, and yet they expect China to do this. So the U.S. is doing absolutely everything to provoke a war with China. They are violating Chinese sovereignty. They are violating international law to do so. And they say, well, we're not sure if we could avoid this war or not. What are they saying? They're saying China needs to accept subordination to us or there will be a war. This is what they're saying. This is what they've been saying for years. China will do what we tell them or there will be a war. If they don't, we have no choice but to continue escalating. This is what they're saying. This is what they were saying to Russia. And Russia made a decision that Ukraine is where they're drawing the line that far and no further. And now they're trying to force China into a very similar situation.
Well, the bad PR is about to get worse, so let's finish up here.
American surveillance plane and this Chinese warship crossing dangerously close to an American ship in the South China Sea. Minahan now preparing with Exercise Mobility Guardian, 70 aircraft and more than 3,000 airmen from 7 countries, the largest readiness exercise in the command's history, including this British cargo plane dropping off U.S. equipment, then simulating a medical evacuation. Also practicing resupplying bases in remote areas.
Cargo door, acknowledged.
This mission to drop supplies to airmen establishing a base on a tiny island north of Guam.
We're directly over the drop zone right now. About a dozen aircraft are beginning to drop their supplies and aid to the troops below.
In his memo, Minahan told airmen to get ready by firing from a clip and to aim for the head.
I'm not trying to be provocative. I'm trying to provide my formation with the tools and the action and the priority necessary to win.
Do you still agree with everything you wrote in that January memo?
I agree absolutely with the urgency and the action.
Are you ready now?
We are ready now.
That assurance coming even as some critics have voiced concerns the U.S. is not modernizing equipment fast enough for a potential conflict. But Minahan telling us exercises like these are critical to being ready.
Tonight,
I mean, that it's just right out there for everyone to see. Even just the attitude of the reporter, just like, are you ready for war with China now? It's like, I mean, I'm glad we do what we do. They're almost doing it for us, though. But please, any reactions?
Well, think about it. There's a Chinese warplane flying in front of a U.S. warplane. Where was this happening? Was this like off the coast of San Francisco? No, it was on the other side of the Pacific, off China's coast. As a matter of fact, the U.S. is incapable of operating anywhere near China. These provocations would be impossible if the United States did not have military bases in Japan, and now they're expanding them in the Philippines. Without those bases, they wouldn't even have the ability to be there in the first place. That is how far across the ocean they have come to provoke this conflict with China, to raise these tensions with China. Now, they were saying this ship that was crossing in front of the U.S. warship, this Chinese ship, where was that? That was right off the coast of China. I think it was like 80 kilometers or 80 miles. I forget which one, but that's pretty close. That's much closer to China than it is to anywhere in the United States. And imagine if it was the other way around. And I saw people on Twitter commenting about this. So like, oh, come on. China does that too. Here's an article about a Chinese and Russian ship off the coast of Alaska. When you look at it, if people are familiar with Alaska, there's the mainland, and then there's these Aleutian islands that stretch all the way to Russia. And they were way off the coast of one of these very distant islands. It's not equivalent in any way. And that's the best that they can do. That's the best that they can do to make an argument that somehow this is normal and that it's not the U.S. provoking China, that's bad. That's and one more point I want to make, because I see a lot of people buying into this. People who would agree with us on Ukraine, they say, no, China is the problem. And I just want to ask these people, why are you almost verbatim repeating U.S. State Department talking points when you realize the State Department has lied about absolutely everything else all throughout history, from Iraq during Desert Storm to Afghanistan to Iraq again, Libya, Syria, Ukraine? Why is China the first thing you think they're actually telling the truth about? And in reality, people have to start asking themselves, what about themselves is allowing them to keep their mind open to the State Department regarding China, but nothing else? And I think they have to ask themselves about possibly racism or some sort of irrational ideological hatred that they have because they heard the word communist and they've never been to China and they don't know anything about China. Danny, you were just in China. Was the Communist Party of China like running the 7-Elevens over there?
It's funny. It's like you might have Communist Party members running a 7-Eleven over there, but certainly no. There's in China, like business happens just like business happens anywhere else, except the one difference is that you do have more government regulation. You have, right, for those very, the Pradas. I was in Shanghai. If you have Pradas, all of that stuff, yeah, they're super expensive and all of that. But if you want to like live like a Chinese person, you can go and get things at places that are much more tightly regulated. The businesses can exist. So economically, things were rough because of COVID and a lot of other things happening in the world. But certainly the things are getting better and better and better economically with the regenerated activity post-COVID, all those restrictions / the world economy shifting all over the place all the time. So yeah, things, people live pretty normal lives in China, whether they are Communist Party members or they support the party. One thing if you do go to China, unlike other countries, even like a Cuba, you go to Cuba, walk around the tourist areas and people will try to like appease you and say, oh, we know you don't like communism. So they'll try to like, satisfy you. But in China, they don't do that. They're like, if you ask them, do you like your government? Do you like the Communist Party? Even if they're not a part of it, you're more likely to get a yes answer because things just get better under the Communist Party of China. And I even met business people. I met the former assistant to Jack Ma, and I know that you'll have me on Thursday to talk more about all this stuff. But I met even a guy like him. He's not a Communist Party member. He's not, he's not someone who would call himself like a communist, but he's like, I want to teach people about the real China because there are opportunities here. And even people like myself, we can be part of something better. Even if we are just trying to do business, like we can be part of something better and we can, make this country beautiful, grow. I can make money. Everybody can make money. We don't have to live in this. Oh, sorry. It was like a really loud noise. Anyway, we don't have to live in this dichotomy of, either you're socialist and poor, capitalist and rich. Like that's just not how the world works anymore. But in any event, I wanted to just, with what you were saying, it's like Mike Minahan, what a great example of everything that we talk about. He's literally saying we are preparing for war with China. I mean, is there any more indication that we need for those people who question, like, even if you can, whatever you think about China, and I could talk for days about China and how I feel about it and all the progress being made, and regardless of whatever's happening internally that still needs to be resolved, there's a lot good going on. But even if you don't believe me or agree, it's like you're going to agree with this guy. You're going to agree with Mike Minahan. He's literally telling you, let's get into an incredibly dangerous conflict with China that will not end well for the U.S. and it won't end well for the world. But yeah, there definitely is this difference between how people perceive China, and we should do more reflecting on the reasons why. Anyway, I want to kick it back to you.
Yeah, well, getting back to this, the United States preparing for war with China, it's almost a tropism. It's as if it's unconscious, like a tree reaches down for nutrients or reaches up for sunlight. This is what it seems like the United States is doing on its path toward war with China. It cannot even imagine any other option because it has existed as a hegemon for decades, if not longer. And now that's coming to an end. The whole way the United States is organized economically and politically is as a hegemon. And it cannot imagine a world where it is not on the top, that it is not the most powerful economy and military on earth. It cannot imagine a world order where it is unable to act with impunity. And this is what China and Russia and many other nations investing in multipolarism are doing. They are making it more and more difficult for the United States and Europe to act with impunity anywhere they go in the world. They look at what China is doing in Africa, for example, building infrastructure, building these countries up that the US and Europe have kicked onto the ground, have kept there specifically to make it easier to exploit and to act with impunity across the continent. And as they build these countries up, they get stronger economically, they'll get stronger politically and militarily, and they'll be able to tell the West no, and they'll be able to back it up. And this is the worst nightmare for a hegemon. And I think that distinguishes, that is how you can tell the difference between what China is doing with multipolarism and what the West is doing by clinging to unipolarism. China is building other nations up. They are creating a balance of power that will not only keep the United States in check, but will also keep themselves in check. Anyone in the future that comes to power in China is going to see a world China helped make stronger and helped level the playing field and helped balance power globally. It'll be much more difficult for them to do that than it was for the West to gain and maintain hegemony for so long. So all of these things people need to keep in mind. And getting back to the US waging war on China, I mean, just look at the people running the United States. They're incapable of achieving their goals, but they are incapable of accepting that fact. And so they're going to continue forward. And just as with the proxy war in Ukraine against Russia, they are not the ones paying the price, not in blood and not in treasure. As a matter of fact, they're enriching themselves by doing it. So they have no incentive to stop. That's why the rest of us, we have to invest in anything that we can to try to stop this, to raise awareness, to expose it, and to speak out and to oppose it.
Definitely. And I'm glad you brought up the difference of how China is relating to the world and developing its relations with other countries, especially in the global south, all across the global south. Definitely, let's end there. Let's end the conversation with, because I have some examples I wanted to discuss with you about that. But before we get there, let's maybe put our focus on the last story I had up, which is related to Taiwan. So as we had talked about in past conversations, including this one, the United States has been conducting fake diplomacy. But one of the areas that seems to be very consistent in terms of the opposite of diplomacy and aggression, not least all of the various ways the U.S. is escalating militarily with China. But there's also this question of Taiwan. Taiwan, of course, is a point of U.S. militarization in the Pacific, and maybe the most consequential one, given the fact that China recognizes Taiwan as its own sovereign territory. But now we have elections coming up, and we've talked about on this program how the Tsai Ing-wen-led DPP didn't do so well in the election locally, county, municipal. But still, there is going to be a presidential election. The DPP is going to run a different candidate because Tsai Ing-wen was forced to resign. But I'm just going to pull up the story. Let's pull up the Financial Times first. Taiwan election candidate risks China's anger with planned U.S. trip. So Mr. Lai Ching-te Taiwan's vice president and the ruling party candidate for January's presidential election, is going to make 2 stops in the United States on a trip to South America next month, so in August, risking further threats from China. So he plans on stopping in the U.S. It's not so clear about where he's going to visit. Of course, you had Tsai Ing-wen, I believe, not too long ago. I forget what period that was. Tsai Ing-wen recently visited. I would like to say that was a couple of months ago. And then, of course, you had Nancy Pelosi's famous visit to the island in August. Both of those instances, the Kevin McCarthy conversation in California that happened just a few months ago, and then Pelosi's a bit before, both of them led to pretty intense military exercises. I think downplayed a bit, but pretty intense. It was a real show of Taiwan can be blockaded at any point by the mainland whenever the PLA decides. But what is your take? What is your reaction to another example? It seems like it just doesn't stop of the U.S. having official meetings, it seems like, with Taiwan political candidates and current political administration.
And I wonder where he's going to go in South America.
They don't say yet.
I'm pretty sure it's like one of the
Paraguay. I think Paraguay, which is probably, I don't know if Paraguay recognizes Taiwan as, or the ROC, the Republic of China. People don't understand. It's not Taiwan. It's the Republic of China that they're recognizing. But continue.
Yes. Well, I was going to say they're most likely going to visit one of the only countries in the world that recognize the Republic of China as the legitimate government of all of China, because that's what this is actually about. A lot of people misunderstand this, and it's not their fault, because the Western media, in a very concerted way, which tells you just how controlled the Western corporate media and established media is, they make it out as if Taiwan is a country that China is bullying. But in reality, the Republic of China in Taipei, on the island of Taiwan, they see themselves as the sole legitimate government of all of China, including all of the rest of China, all 1.4 billion people. That's how they see it in their minds. And that's how these countries that recognize the Republic of China, that's how they see it also, that is the sole legitimate government of all of China, which is why Beijing will not deal with a country that does that, because obviously the Republic of China is not in charge of all of China. They're not even in charge of the island province of Taiwan. Really, Washington is. And so that's one thing people have to understand. The other thing people have to understand is that the vast majority of nations on Earth, and then also the United Nations, recognize Taiwan as part of China, and that the People's Republic of China in Beijing is the only legitimate government over all of China, including Taiwan. The United States officially sees it that way. Australia, the UK, the whole AUKUS, all of the countries in Europe, they all see it that way. And yet they play this double game where they pretend Taiwan is an independent country. They encourage separatism on the island province of Taiwan, and they're also arming them. They're sending them weapons for a very similar confrontation that we see between Ukraine and Russia, only Taiwan is part of China. So it's actually much worse. It's much, much worse. So this is important to understand. And this is, again, the United States is playing this game of diplomacy while at the same time continuing unabated this support of separatism in Taiwan. Now, the Democratic Progressive Party, it really doesn't matter who's in charge. They are a figurehead, they are a proxy, and they will do whatever Washington tells them. Their existence politically depends entirely on Washington. Without that support, they would not exist. So it doesn't matter if it's Tsai Ing-wen or Lai Ching-te. It doesn't matter, because they answer to Washington ultimately. And they do so at the expense of everyone living on the island of Taiwan. That's very important to understand. The economy of Taiwan is integrated with the rest of China. It depends on China as its largest export market and also source of imports. And a lot of those imports fuel its semiconductor industry and its electrical component industry. These are the two largest, most important industries on the island. When you look at all of this, you could see the United States is not helping Taiwan. They are They are setting it up for catastrophe. They will destroy its economy. They will make the island uninhabitable, just like they're destroying Ukraine right now, just like they destroyed Libya, just like they destroy everyone they're supposedly helping. It's very important for people to understand this. And as this story continues to develop, as Taiwan prepares for elections, people need to understand all of these fundamentals, because the Western media, again, is going to make it out as if this is an independent country that China is bullying.
Yeah, and the claim to fame, as we spoke about before we got on to discuss this, Brian, for Lai Ching-te, the current candidate for the DPP for the next presidential election, 2024, he wrote a Wall Street Journal article that the mainland, that the People's Republic of China got really angry about, because in it he talked about the 4 pillars for peace. And basically all of the pillars had something to do with preparing Taiwan for a conflict with China. And a huge part of that was increasing U.S. and Western support militarily. And that was very controversial, of course, for the mainland. And I want to pull up actually why that might be so controversial, because many people might not know, this isn't the official document, but these are main points from, let's see who wrote it's from supplementary documents on the joint communique. And there was a third joint communique in 1982 that is a little more contested than the other two in terms of the language. But the 6th point is very important, even though there were disagreements about whether the U.S., it all has to do with arms sales to Taiwan. And there are disagreements in this about whether it should happen at all or shouldn't happen at all. But this, during the Reagan administration, it was negotiated. And I just want to read the 6th point here. Having in mind the foregoing statements on both sides, the U.S. government states it does not seek to carry out a long-term policy of arms sales to Taiwan, and that its arms sales to Taiwan will not exceed, either in quantitative or qualitative terms, the level of those supplied in recent years since the establishment of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and China, and that it intends to reduce gradually its sales of arms to Taiwan, leading over a period of time to a final resolution. In so stating, the U.S. acknowledges China's consistent position regarding the settlement of this issue. So the U.S. did, in fact, promise. It did, in fact, promise that it would eventually reduce. And not only would it reduce immediately every single year arms sales to Taiwan, but eventually it would lead to a final resolution, which ostensibly means ending it. Now, the exact opposite has occurred here. You even have candidates advocating for more. So this is a complete violation. I mean, what's your response?
Exactly. The United States made a very clear agreement with China over Taiwan. They ended their support of the Republic of China. It was kicked out of the UN, basically. It is not recognized as a government except by a very small handful of countries. It's less than 20 countries, less than 15, I think. And they're very tiny countries that you wouldn't even think about until you heard it. You'd be like, oh, yeah, I forgot that is a country. But this is what they're doing. They agreed to this, and they agreed to start winding down weapons sales. But then when you listen to, say, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken talk about the One China policy, he's like, yes, we believe in the One China policy, but we also have the Taiwan Relations Act. Well, the Taiwan Relations Act was a unilateral act passed by U.S. Congress with no input at all from China. It just said, whatever we agreed with China, forget about it. We can do this because we just passed the Taiwan Relations Act. We can send weapons to Taiwan. We could do whatever we want with Taiwan. It's the U.S. doing what it always does. It makes deals, and then when it doesn't suit them anymore, they break them, or they never planned to honor them in the first place. It was just a ruse to get China to work with the United States against the Soviet Union, if people remember. And then once they were done using China, they were going to fully violate these agreements without any qualms at all. And if people remember, this is also in the 1980s that the United States, with the National Endowment for Democracy, they began an attempt to undermine the Chinese government and overthrow it. This was what the Tiananmen Square incident was all about. Those were violent protesters who were attacking police and soldiers, killed police and soldiers, took their weapons from them, destroyed military equipment, and then the military moved in on them. This is what actually happened versus the massacre, where everybody was peaceful and the Chinese army just ran them over with tanks. That is not what happened. And that is even in US diplomatic cables that were leaked later on. So they, in their mind, they said, well, we'll make this agreement with them now to make them happy, but eventually we'll overthrow the government. It'll collapse just like the Soviet Union, so we don't have to worry about it. But now in 2023, that is not what happened. And this agreement is a huge inconvenience for them. So they're just sidestepping it. They say publicly that they still uphold it, but their actions are entirely undermining it.
Yeah, and I can list off some of these countries that have. This is full diplomatic relations with the Republic of China. Again, big difference between there is no such thing as any kind of Republic of Taiwan or independent Taiwan or what have you. If anyone talks about that in the West, in the US, collective West, the media, political class, it doesn't matter. When they're talking about that, they're literally, it's a story. It doesn't exist. It's a fantasy. It has no basis in reality. But even with the Republic of China, it's countries like Belize, it's entirely basically some countries in South America, some countries in the Caribbean, some countries in what's known as Micronesia, Polynesia. So, countries like Haiti, which is unfortunately a completely wrecked country because of the United States. Paraguay, which is where he's going to go.
Yes,
exactly. He's going to go.
We called it.
Li Chengtai, he's going to go there. I'm sure he'll be I don't know if he'll be going to Guatemala, but it's right around the corner. Marshall Islands, which is essentially a U.S. colony, which devastating effects from U.S. military occupation there and nuclear testing, and places like Palau and Nauru and Micronesian, very small islands that essentially you wouldn't really consider as having much influence.
13 in total.
13 in total. And
that's not a lot.
Not a lot. And the political situations in all of these countries are incredibly unfortunate, and I think what you've seen too is countries, Nicaragua, Honduras, they've dropped these foreign relations in favor of joining China and the Belt and Road Initiative. So I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about that development, because this is a steady. I don't see many of these countries continuing either. Like St. Vincent of the Grenadines is on this list, and I could easily see that country go differently because their relations with China are pretty strong. And it seems like the U.S. is relying on very unstable countries, dependent countries, for this kind of support.
And this list has actually been getting shorter and shorter. I think it's actually 12, not 13. If Honduras now has a one China policy recognizing Beijing and not the Republic of China, then that's 12 then. And also recently was the Solomon Islands. And we remember the United States paid the opposition to build a violent mob to go to the Capitol and start killing people and burning things down. That's how the United States does business. That's how you have countries that recognize the Republic of China, even though it makes no sense politically, diplomatically, economically. It makes zero sense. You are cutting yourself off from the most populous country on earth, the largest industrial base on earth, the second largest economy on earth. Why would you do that? How does it benefit you? It doesn't. This is, again, another example of the US pointing the finger at China and saying China's the one going around bullying people while they coerce nations to recognize the Republic of China, while they themselves officially recognize Beijing. I mean, when you really think about it, it's insane. When you really look at it, it's completely insane. And the way the Western media presents this as some sort of rational policy, and that's China, they're the ones with the problem and they're the ones creating a problem. It's surreal, and so many people are buying into it. And that's why we have to repeat these things over and over and over again, because for every time we repeat it, the Western media has people out there saying it 100 more times, probably much more than 100. So this is the game that is unfolding. It's the same here in Southeast Asia. I'm in Thailand. The U.S. is trying to get their opposition into power after the general election, and they are openly anti-China, even though China is Thailand's largest trade partner. Largest source of tourism by far is China. More tourists come from China to Thailand than from all Western nations combined, and they will be throwing all of that away to satisfy Washington. And what is Washington offering in return? Absolutely nothing. They have nothing to offer. They cannot offer the economic benefits trade with China offers. They cannot. Even in terms of weapons, China now makes better weapons that are cheaper and more effective than anything they're going to buy from the United States. There's really no, other than the US being a large export market, there's no reason to even be doing business with the US. And I'm not saying that because America is bad. I'm saying that in the context of the current government, the current circles of interest running the United States, there's no reason to subject yourself to the way they do business. They have nothing to offer that justifies it, except possible escape from destabilization, death, and destruction. And that does compel a lot of countries to go along.
Yeah, and maybe the final question on this issue of Taiwan. We often get the comparison Taiwan and Ukraine. Given all that we've spoken about here, do you, in prior conversations, do you foresee that kind of conflict igniting? I mean, there's so many factors here, but every time every time I think to myself, nah, it just can't go the same way. The U.S. pushes the envelope further and further and further. And while it might not look the same, I mean, do you foresee the conflict with China happening here in this particular issue? And if so, like, how would that go? How is that going to go? Anyway, I want to kick that to you.
The United States itself is comparing the situation in Taiwan with Ukraine. They write endless articles about how Ukraine is a great example for Taiwan to follow. And when you think about that, when we talk about things that are insane, they're saying, look, hey, Taiwan, look at Ukraine, look at it. It's being completely destroyed, hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced. This is a good model for you to follow. And then read the think tanks. You're asking how will it go? The think tanks in the United States, funded by the government, funded by the arms industry, have done war games. And they say, yes, we will win in Taiwan. All of the infrastructure will be destroyed. The chip industry gone. There will be no economy left, but you will have your political independence, which they don't, because they're dependent on the United States. They have no political independence. They're economically, culturally integrated with the rest of China, and politically they are controlled, captured by the United States. So it wouldn't even be political independence. And they're admitting that Taiwan would be destroyed in the process. The US at this point would lose tens of thousands of personnel, hundreds of aircraft, several aircraft carriers, other surface vessels. It would be catastrophic losses the United States has never seen in the 21st century. So that's how it would go if it happened and they won. And then imagine how bad it would go if they lost, which they probably will, considering what's going on in Ukraine and the expectations of Western trained Ukrainian troops fighting the Russians, and how those expectations didn't even come close to reality. I think we're going to see something very similar in any conflict between the US and China. Remember, the US has to cross an entire ocean to fight China right off its own coast. China has all of the advantages in terms of military industrial output, which we can now see how important that is regarding the conflict in Ukraine right now. And we can see that the US is behind, and they will be behind for years. And when they finally catch up, Russia and China will be even further ahead. This is what they don't seem to understand. So again, the clock is ticking. The window of opportunity is closing. They're rushing to provoke a conflict now. So you asked if it's possible that we will see a conflict over Taiwan. I believe Taiwan would be one of the most probable flashpoints. They will do everything in their power to make it happen. I don't see any other option because they will not accept allowing China to surpass them without a fight. They will not. So I think we're headed that way. And it's going to be up to China to avoid it, to do something to either deter the United States long enough so that it's not even a possibility, or to weather the provocations, the humiliation that the U.S. subjects China to over Taiwan, to continue weathering it until China does irreversibly surpass the United States. And then, like, let's just say the U.S. says we're going to put several brigades of U.S. forces on Taiwan, and they put them there. But the Chinese economy on the mainland continues to grow. The U.S. continues to decline. In 5 or 10 years, what will that mean? China thinks long term like this. They don't react to provocations the same way the West does, because again, the fundamentals are in favor of China, not the collective West at this point.
Yeah, indeed. Well, now I think is an appropriate time because as the U.S. continues to push for war, and as you said, has nothing to offer in any other area, despite being this hegemon and perhaps oversized influence in the geopolitical realm. There is a lot happening, and I know you follow Asia a lot in particular, but maybe we can focus both on Asia and Africa with regard to what China is doing. And I just want to pull up because there's this issue of cluster bombs that is often spoken about now, given that the United States is handing cluster bombs to Ukraine and the consequences of that. Well, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, these countries know what that is like very well. And I wanted to first pull up what has been happening between China and Laos. So this article is in the Maldives news network. And in 2021, there was the launch of the Sino-Lao Railway. And here you can see it's the high-speed rail that's connecting, I believe it's the capital of Laos to Kunming in China. And so here, though, is an important fact that I don't think many people know, is that the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs discussed how during the construction of this railway for 2 years, January 27 to July 2019, so about 2.5 years, about 459 unexploded ordnance and more than 460 pieces of related debris were removed from about 2,931 hectares of land. So these kind of bombs, the landmines, the cluster bombs, China was literally part of that assistance. And now I just want to pull up the results of that. What exactly happened? Now, not only is the Sino-Lao Railway doing, commercial trade and various other activities, but it's also now open for passenger service across the border. So here is just a short video showing what from Xinhua News, so Chinese state news media. But I think it's a good picture into what China is doing with partner countries like Laos to build something that actually benefits everybody. So here we go.
Hello, I'm Li Huayan with the Xinhua News Agency. I'm at Kunming Railway Station in Kunming City, capital of Southwest China's Yunnan province. Today, the cross-border passenger train will be launched on the China-Laos Railway.
The train, which is packed to capacity for this trip, will travel at a speed of up to 160 kilometers per hour through mountains and valleys. There are 8 stations along the route that stretches over 1,000 kilometers, and the journey takes 10.5 hours, including the time spent on going through customs.
In order to provide the excellent and perfect service to all of passengers, so our staff getting highly trained to increase the skill, including language skill and vocational skill, and so on. And also in our dining hall, we provide different dinner for all of type of people.
The China-Laos Railway began operation in December 2021. It's a landmark project showcasing high-quality belt and road cooperation. The launch of the cross-border passenger services is a move expected to boost regional connectivity.
第一次做火车旅游，之前都是坐飞机。
我们俩打算先从老挝的琅勃拉邦玩起，看看琅勃拉邦的寺庙呀和瀑布，主要是看人文，然后再去老挝万荣，听说那里是徒步的天堂，有很多徒步的项目可以玩，然后最后再去老挝的万象。
我们公司是主要从事汽车相关行业的，到老挝也是主要考察一下老挝的市场。
The China-Laos Railway is a docking project between the Belt and Road Initiative and the Laos strategy to convert itself from a landlocked country to a land-linked hub.
มาเลยอย่างที่เปิดการเชื่อมจอดระหว่างรถไฟลาวจีนไปหาประเทศจีนหรือว่าประเทศจีนมาลาวเนี่ยก็ถือว่าเป็นเปิ้นว่าพระพุทธศาสนาแห่งการประพันธ์การทำมือเฮ็ดให้ประชาชนลาวพอนี่อันนึงมันจะได้มีความสะดวกสบายในการไปหาสู่กันอันที่สองมาก็สองประเทศนี้ประชาชนสองประเทศนี้จะได้เรียนรู้วัฒนธรรมขนบธรรมเนียมของกันและกันหลายขึ้นสามารถจะมีความสะดวกให้นักท่องเที่ยวบ่ว่าจะลาวแล้วก็ตามประเทศไปประเทศจีนหลายขึ้นแล้วนักท่องเที่ยวจีนก็จะมาประเทศลาวหลายขึ้นความจริงแล้วข้าพเจ้ามีความรู้สึกภาคภูมิใจและการเปิดรถไฟข้ามแดนระหว่างลาวจีนเวียงจันทน์คุณหนึ่งเนี่ยซึ่งเป็นชิดหมายประวัติศาสตร์ในการปกปักร่วมมือรักษาอีกอันหนึ่งจะเป็นความมิตรหมายที่ดีโดยเฉพาะคนลาวจะได้ข้ามไปจีนโดยผ่านรถไฟ
So, I mean that
from 3 days to 10 hours. And I saw people in the comment section commenting, and they were talking about the script in Lao looking like Thai language. It's very similar. If you can read Thai, you can basically read Lao. There's just a couple you might have to figure out. And the language is very similar. So if you speak Thai, a lot of people in Laos speak Thai, but also their own language is very similar, just FYI. And they also talked about Thai people crossing the border to ride on the train. And I have Thai friends who have done that. They have gone to Laos just to ride the high-speed train. And it's incredible. So we always hear the Western media, oh, these are debt trap boondoggles that have no meaning, irrelevant. You know, we build political whatever, like things that are intangible, and they're just building railways. And it's, a railway is actually how you build a modern, a thriving civilization. You need infrastructure, you need power, you need transportation, you need rail. And if you're not doing that, then you're going to be left behind. And the West doesn't offer that. They offer them political meddling, political parties, human rights organizations that don't actually care about human rights, all of this meddling in the internal political affairs, the education system, like an infection just taking over everything. They don't build infrastructure. China builds infrastructure. Worse still, when the U.S. attempts to politically capture a country through, say, color revolution or undermining and through sedition, if that doesn't work, they use warfare and they drop bombs, and they drop more bombs on Laos than there were even human beings living there. To this day, unexploded ordnance, I believe there's about 8 per man, woman, and child living in the country. That's how many are still there. And so when people say China builds and the U.S. bombs, that is absolutely true. It's not a boondoggle. There was a woman there that said she had never been on a train before. A lot of people in Laos, everyone in Laos was never on a train before because they never had a train before. Think about that. And so the U.S. for decades held more or less primacy over Asia, and that's what they did with that primacy: bombing and undermining progress and development, pseudo development. USAID would come in and build some water towers in rural villages so that they wouldn't have to depend on the central government, so that they could encourage separatism. That's what the U.S. has been doing in this region. China is now coming in and connecting everyone with infrastructure, all kinds of infrastructure projects. This high-speed rail is just one of many examples. There's a high-speed rail link that will go from Laos to Thailand to Bangkok and then onward to Malaysia, possibly Singapore. And this is going to drive development. It's going to drive the economy. And already Thailand has standard rail all throughout the country. They are moving goods by truck and rail to the border to take advantage of the high-speed rail now that it exists. So it is definitely not debt trap diplomacy. This is real development, and it's China that's doing it, and it's the United States. When they say we're going to answer to the Belt and Road Initiative, they have no answer. They can't compete with it. What they mean by that is they're going to stop it. They're going to roll it back. And if they need to, they will physically destroy it, which we talked about earlier. They are actually doing that and have been for years. So again, this is the reality of things. And for people out there who understand that the Western media is lying to them about everywhere else, but when it comes to China, they say, oh, they're just trying to take over Southeast Asia. They're trying to take over Africa. They're building the rail to get the resources out. They're not doing that. I've seen it with my own eyes, and you can look at the development that it's driving. It is tangible. You can see it with your eyes.
Definitely. And at the moment, actually, Algeria's president, he is visiting China, and he's getting the red carpet treatment, unlike how the United States treats other leaders, which is essentially, I mean, how many times does the U.S. actually invite other leaders to the White House, unless it's bringing in Yoon Suk Yeol to sing American Pie and humiliate himself, and or bringing Modi in to try to how should I say, bribe him into leaving BRICS. Other than that, you don't really have much diplomacy at all. So Abdulmajid Tebboune, he is in Beijing right now for a 5-day visit. And at the same time, there was this story reported, Brian, and I know you have been sharing content about how what the U.S. did to Libya. It destroyed the country, but what the U.S. is building in places, what China is building in places like Kenya is actually achieving development. But there's this interesting story happening right now all over the world, a humongous heat wave. It is devastating. When I was in China, the heat was just overwhelming at times. 105 degrees in Beijing sometimes. In Shanghai, it would be 99 with like humidity to a level I've never experienced, even though I've been many humid places. But here you have Chinese contractors literally completing the final stretch of a highway in an incredible heat wave all across the continent. And so it's the east-west highway in Algeria's easternmost province. The workers, Algerian and Chinese, are braving extreme heat, laying asphalt. I don't know if anyone's ever laid asphalt in extreme heat. That is brutal stuff. But according to the highway project, the head of the highway project at Algeria's National Highway Agency told Xinhua that the section holds this highway pivotal importance because its opening signifies the full completion of a 1,216 kilometer long east-west highway connecting 17 Algerian provinces and bringing the country closer to other Arab countries. So I just wanted to bring that up as another example. We're talking about over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, over 30 plus degrees Celsius every single day during this heat wave, and still they're rushing to complete it. Even during the pandemic, everything was shut down. China did not shut down its projects abroad. It continued to help out its Belt and Road countries. And we're talking about more than $1 trillion US, which is a lot of money in Chinese terms, invested all around the world for these kind of projects. But I'll kick it back to you, Brian.
Absolutely. I just recently shared a post on Telegram from Jeremy Nell of Germ Warfare, and he showed the destruction of Libya. And then he showed a new rail station in Kenya, and he was comparing and contrasting the U.S. approach to foreign policy and China's. And again, it's the U.S. bombs and divides and destroys, and China builds and connects people together. And in the comment section, and I get people like this in my audience, and I'm sure you do too, Danny, where they agree with you on everything else, but when it comes to China, they said no, absolutely not. Oh, the railway in Kenya is not turning over a profit, and they miss so many points here, because rail or any other type of infrastructure is not the same as a private business where you set it up and you need it to make money or you go out of business. It's not the same. Infrastructure has a much greater value than it in and of itself. It is connecting people together in a country, creating economic opportunities for everyone living in the country. It boosts the entire economy, regardless of how profitable or unprofitable it itself happens to be. And when you open it, it could take years for it to actually, fully get, maximum ridership, turn a profit on certain routes, and for development to really get going along the route. And I remember this because when I first came to Thailand, that was when they were building the elevated train lines in Bangkok. And it had just opened, and it went all the way to the edge of the city, what used to be the edge of the city, I should say. And there's nothing there really. It's very small and quiet. Today, if you go to that same place, there's skyscrapers there, and the city extends out even further because that infrastructure made that possible. You cannot go into an infrastructure project with a private enterprise mentality, because then it will never happen. Look at the United States. It will never happen because there's no profit in it. You have to think bigger than that. It's going to be an engine for progress. And this is what China proved with their high-speed rail internally. A lot of people said that it's going to be a disaster. It's a boondoggle. It's not going to help anything. Well, look at China. Look at it. Danny, you were just there. Look at it. That drove, it drove development, and it will continue to drive development. It has more value than it itself in selling tickets for those train seats or moving freight. It has much more value than that. And that's what people can't understand. Between that innate hatred toward China because of their ideology or their racial views, then you couple that with these U.S. government-funded propaganda narratives, and you put all that together with you don't understand infrastructure and economics, you put that all together and you say, oh, it's debt trap diplomacy. It isn't. Kenya needs trains. Every country, every modern economy needs trains. They need ports. They need schools. They need power plants. They need all of this, or they are not going to have a modern civilization. All the things that we take for granted, they are not going to have. Why shouldn't they have it? Why shouldn't they have train lines connecting their towns and their cities, and then connecting them to other nations to do more trade together? Why can't they have that? So people have to understand they are being tricked into going along with what is fundamentally an anti-human agenda. This is you're against human beings being allowed to have a life, prosper, have peace and stability. You're against that by saying, oh, we have to oppose China. Yes, they're building this, but that it's just to take over everyone. It is not. And people say, well, why are they doing it? They're making money doing the projects, and they're also increasing trade. That's what they do. They do business, and building infrastructure allows them to do more business. It's that simple. It's not an evil scheme like an IMF loan that doesn't build anything tangible. It is building tangible infrastructure so that they can benefit through trade. It's as plain as that. And finally, not to get off too far off the topic, but they don't have an equivalent of the National Endowment for Democracy. They do not have all these organizations and agencies and institutions reaching into another nation's internal political affairs and trying to shape it. They don't do that. As a point, they believe in non-interference, and you can see that. I don't see them coming into Thailand and saying, we're a communist and you're a constitutional monarchy, so obviously we're not doing business with you until the sickle and hammer is flying over your capital. They don't do that. But that is what the United States does. They say, if you don't change your society the way we tell you, we're not doing business with you. If you don't do business with the people we tell you to, we won't do business with you. This is what that's coercion. That is exactly what they project onto China, is actually what they're doing themselves.
Yeah, and I'm no economics major or expert. I would like to say I do study economy, especially political economy, but even with my rudimentary understanding of economics, it's not profitable. Why is the high-speed rail not profitable? That means it's a failure. Why is China investing all over in these projects that end up failing? Because some of them do end up failing, and there are many reasons for it. But at the same time, this whole profitability argument or everything is failing, it totally negates the fact that if you don't have this basic infrastructure, as you said, you don't really have any kind of economy. Forget your model, but you're not going to be able to trade, do commerce. You're not going to be able to develop if you don't have lights on, if you don't have energy, if you don't have roads to drive through, if you don't have railways to get around, to move freight. You're not going to have the ability to run an economy. And that's been the unfortunate reality for a lot of these countries all over the world. Africa, Asia, many parts of Latin America, many parts of the Caribbean they are not connected because they were forcibly disconnected by outside powers, including the United States being a big part of that. So this whole "it's not profitable" thing. I've heard Chinese officials talk about the whole, high-speed rail may not be profitable in the short term. Well, they're like, let's just wait until we are able to implement this into our trade, both domestically, our economic activity, both domestically and abroad. It actually leads to huge gains economically, and also people's lives get better, and that also matters too. And so China never professes and actually actively says, we're not charity. We're not actually giving aid to anybody. Like, this is not aid. This is economic cooperation. But it's quite obvious that China has the model of, well, if you win, if things get better for you, then things will get better for us, because if you get richer, we'll get richer, we'll get stronger, we'll get prosperous together. Because if you don't have an economy that is functional, no matter what model you decide to develop within, we're not going to be able to do any business together. And I think that's the huge difference here. And I just wanted to pull up one last image to talk about. Let's see if it will let me do this. I don't think actually it will. It's not posting. It says window entire screen. I don't know if it'll let me. No. So anyway, the point is it was an image of railway built on the African continent by China. And you see it all over the place, all across Western Central, Northern Africa, Southern Africa. There's just railways everywhere. And this is it, and if you tried to find a similar map for how much the US has built, you wouldn't be able to find one. So I think that's just belaboring the point here, but I just wanted to put that out there. Anyway, any final thoughts on this topic, Brian?
Yeah, I've heard people argue, say with Kenya, China built this railway, and I think it opened in 2017, and they're complaining that it's not profitable, it's not, it's not practical. But the whole point is, in order to have the economic activity that makes it profitable and makes it practical, you have to build it first. It's not the other way around. You don't wait until it's not even feasible to have the type of economic activity that would make it practical without building it first. You have to build it first, and you have to have that foresight of eventually it's going to pay off. It's a long-term project. It's a long-term investment. I don't understand why people can't wrap their minds around that. And second of all, I've heard people say Kenya has much bigger problems. Why are they wasting time building this rail that nobody is using right now? Well, they're not using it right now, but they will increasingly be using it year to year. They say, well, they have terrorist problems, they have this or that problem. Why do you think they have those problems? Because things are not developed yet. The economy isn't doing well enough. That's what creates people who are malcontents or susceptible to extremism and violence and crime. If you improve your economy, you will drain the swamp of violence, of armed violence, of terrorism, armed militancy. Remember Xinjiang, China, Western China. I don't know if you had a chance to go there, Danny, but
I have. Not this trip, but yes, my first time.
and they had a really serious extremism problem, terrorism. Hundreds, thousands of people were being killed. And the terrorism was spreading across China and then across Asia. And then eventually thousands of Uyghur extremists were fighting alongside ISIS in Syria. And what did China do? They didn't bomb them. They began building. They were building infrastructure. They were training people, giving them jobs. And they developed the region. It's far-flung near Central Asia. It's not near the shores. It's not central in any sense of the word, but they built it up. They connected it with the rest of the country. They connected it with the rest of Eurasia. It's a key junction in the Belt and Road project.
Definitely.
And now the violence is gone. Now the terrorism is gone. It's a very stable place. Millions of tourists go there every year now, as a matter of fact, whereas they wouldn't have before. And so that is the importance of thinking long-term, building infrastructure, not saying, well, we have we have terrorism that we have to worry about. Building infrastructure is going to be part of solving terrorism, part of solving instability.
So, Brian, I don't know if you see this. I can't see the screen anymore. Could you see?
I can. Yes, I can.
The screen? Okay, good. Yes. This is what I need 2 monitors, I guess, to truly do this from sharing the screen. But in any event, I just wanted to show, this is the image I was referring to of all of the railway that's been built across the African continent with the help of China, connecting. As you can see, these railways don't just connect within these countries. Anyone who knows the history of Africa knows that a lot of these countries are carve-ups from the old scramble for Africa during the mid-19th century. But you can see here that you have this is a famous railway, actually, the Ethiopia Djibouti Railway here. And then you just have all across, right? Whether it's domestically within countries like Namibia, or whether you're looking at countries being connected in Central Africa. Basically, an incredible example of connectivity. And you won't find, as I said before, you won't find a similar map from the United States' side and from the West, the entire collective West for that matter. And I just think it's, as you said, Brian, it's it's so important to be able to recognize this point, is that this isn't charity, it's not interference. You can go across all these markers in a continent like Africa. China is providing this assistance, and even in its own country, Xinjiang, for example, very similar to some of these poorer countries, even just regionally, very poor part of China, but it is now connected to high-speed rail. It is. I took one 2020, I believe it was at that time. I was able to take one from Gansu province to Xinjiang. Like it's possible. So it exists, and that's one thing that's not often talked about. And but anyway, any closing remarks on the infrastructure issue?
Well, I just think overall, when we look at everything together, it really is important for people to understand that there is a huge difference between what China and Russia and multipolarism is doing versus US-dominated unipolarism. We've watched unipolarism unfold over the decades. We can see the toll it has taken on the planet, and we can see how things that China and Russia are doing, it's undoing a lot of the damage, literally undoing the damage the US has done. They were removing unexploded ordnance the US dropped on Laos to then build the country's first railway, to take this impoverished, landlocked country that was bombed by millions of munitions, millions of tons of munitions. And now they're building railway across it, connecting these people, bringing in tourism, bringing their agricultural goods to markets in China, and then eventually also to the rest of Thailand. I mean, it's a no-brainer. It really is. And that's why the United States is, when they say they're going to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative, like I said, they're not competing with it. What they mean is they're going to poison people against China by lying to them, and then also funding militants and opposition groups to oppose it or even physically destroy the infrastructure. That is the battle that we are seeing unfold now worldwide. The proxy war in Ukraine against Russia is part of it. This conflict with Taiwan in the center of it, that is part of it. The South China Sea also, and also all of these political crises that I cover here in Southeast Asia. It's all tied to this one single, I guess you could say, geopolitical struggle between unipolarism and multipolarism. And I know which side I am on, and I think people should start to think about it in these terms, not left or right, conservative or liberal. These are meaningless labels. What do you actually believe in? What do you want the world to look like in the future? That's why I think we need to start asking. Danny, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, no, totally. I agree with you, especially since I believe that any political understanding, any political orientation that one takes, it should be grounded in what's the reality in front of us. So what are the forces moving toward progress? What are the forces that are arresting progress or doing the opposite, bringing humanity, bringing entire nations, entire majorities of people into an abyss? And once we start asking that question, especially on a global scale, we can actually take a position. And so, a lot of things are coming up. The 2024 election here in the United States, the BRICS summit. I'm sure we'll be talking further about all of these things as they heat up. And, for me, just to end, and I can get your final remarks here too, is for me, it's like these are not just no-brainers, but increasingly they are becoming, and for me, they've always have been, but I think also they are. Sometimes we talk about purity, like it's purity test. Purity is, on these questions, given the consequences, it's going to be more important. Maybe we shouldn't frame it as purity terms, but in terms of, how firm should we be about questions that are truly existential for all of us, not simply the interests of the elite or whoever is pulling the strings on things like the Ukraine proxy war, but these matters of concern that truly do hold the future of all of us in their hands. I think being firm, right, on these questions is important, especially as we come up on these pretty important events for the entire world, the BRIC summit, and of course, and unfortunately, the U.S. presidential elections end up being important for the world as well. But anyway, any closing remarks before we begin to wrap up here?
No, I just think thank you very much for having me on. I think this is an important conversation that we have to keep having and keep developing as events unfold. It's so important that people understand the big picture rather than being solely focused on the conflict in Ukraine. A lot of people are interested in it. They follow it day to day, and I get that. But you need to also understand it in the wider context. The political crisis, say here in Thailand, it's not really in the news, but it's simmering. It's one of those things that are always simmering until it's headlines and people wonder, how did this all happen? It's happening under the surface over many years, and then suddenly there will be chaos and violence, and it'll be in the headlines. We have to understand that in the bigger picture. And I talked about labels and ideology, and that's how people try to approach these. They look at it in a very isolated way, and they look who's left, who's right, and I'll be on the side of whoever superficially appears left, and then they leave out the fact that the NED is funding them, and the way it fits into the US versus China struggle, and then the whole multipolarism versus unipolarism struggle. So we have to always make sure we zoom out. It's okay to look at something in depth, up close. We also have to always make sure we take time to zoom out and see the full context that these things are unfolding in. It's really important that we just keep at it. I personally, I feel that it's a very unpleasant thing to do. I don't enjoy doing it. I don't enjoy talking about war and following it and watching what's unfolding. But it's important because it is. You said it's existential. It is. It's life and death. Where things are headed, it's life and death. Whether multipolarism prevails or not, it's going to be the difference of life and death for many people all around the globe.
Indeed. Well, everybody, before you go, make sure you click on the tag. Actually, I believe the new atlas is tagged here. Subscribe and support Brian's work. And also, before you go, please do like the stream. Also, consider supporting this channel. I actually did quite enjoy the vlogging experience, and I am beginning to update equipment, which will help this channel grow and continue and be sustainable in the long term. So become a member if you can on Patreon, Substack, or YouTube. You can find all of those links in the description. And maybe, in October, I believe I will be in Vietnam. Maybe one day, Brian, I will be in Thailand. And so, yes, please do support this work and help grow this program. And with that said, everybody, that is all for today. And we will be back. I believe actually we're going to connect on your channel, Brian, on Thursday.
Yeah.
So yes, so Thursday 9 a.m. we're going to talk more in depth about China, my trip there, my experiences there, and compared to Europe, I believe, which will be really fun. So thanks everyone in the chat. Thank you to the moderators. Thank you to everyone who gave a super chat, YouTube members, Substack members, Patreon members, and everybody who is watching. Thanks so much. And I will see you again on the next stream. Bye-bye.